You should be grateful you even have a seat at this table, Ashley said with a light laugh, as if she had just made an innocent joke. And for a brief second, no one moved, no one breathed, and Margaret Collins simply sat there at the far end of the dining table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture straight, her expression calm, as though the words hadn't landed exactly where they were meant to, though something in the room shifted in a way that could not be undone, because just moments earlier, everything had looked exactly as it should. The long oak table polished to a soft shine, the warm glow of overhead lights reflecting off neatly arranged plates, glasses filled halfway with iced water, the scent of roasted chicken and rosemary drifting gently through the air. And Margaret had taken quiet pride in every detail, in the way she always did, making sure the napkins were folded just right, making sure Daniel liked the way the potatoes were seasoned, making sure Ashley had her preferred sparkling water chilled just enough, because for Margaret, these dinners were never just about food. They were about holding something together that she could feel, more and more, lately, slipping through her fingers. And yet she smiled when they arrived, greeted them at the door with the same warmth she had carried for decades, even when Ashley stepped in first, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, her smile polished but distant, her eyes scanning the room as if evaluating it rather than entering it, and Daniel followed just behind her, quieter than usual, offering his mother a brief hug that felt more like a gesture than a connection, and Margaret noticed it. Of course she did. She noticed everything. The way his arms didn't linger. The way his eyes avoided hers for just a fraction too long. But she said nothing, because she had learned that silence often kept the peace longer than questions ever could. And so dinner began the way it always did, with small talk and polite exchanges, Ashley commenting on how quaint the house felt, Daniel nodding absently, Margaret serving each plate with steady hands, listening more than she spoke, until the conversation slowly turned, almost imperceptibly, into something else, something sharper, something that carried an edge just beneath the surface, Ashley making remarks that hovered somewhere, between humor and critique, about how difficult it must be to maintain a house at Margaret's age, about how things change and people need to adjust, and each comment was delivered with that same effortless smile, that same casual tone, as though nothing she said could possibly be taken the wrong way. And still Margaret remained composed, lifting her glass, taking a small sip, her eyes calm, her face unreadable, because she understood, perhaps more clearly in that moment than ever before, that this was not about a single sentence, not about a careless joke, but about something that had been building quietly over time, something that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself, and now, sitting there in the soft light of her own dining room, surrounded by the people she had spent a lifetime caring for, Margaret could feel it finally surface, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that settled deep within her chest, as steady and undeniable as the ticking of the clock on the wall, and still, she did not react. She did not defend herself. She simply adjusted the edge of her napkin, straightened slightly in her chair, and allowed the silence to stretch, just long enough to make everyone else aware of it, long enough for the weight of Ashley's words to linger in the air, because Margaret Collins had learned, over many years and many disappointments, that sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was nothing at all. Margaret continued serving the meal as if nothing had shifted, her movements steady and deliberate, the same careful rhythm she had followed for years, passing the bowl of green beans, adjusting a plate that was already perfectly aligned, refilling a glass that did not truly need it, because these small actions gave her something to hold on to while the silence around the table settled into something heavier than before. And across from her Ashley leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression relaxed, almost satisfied, as though she had tested a boundary and found no resistance, while Daniel kept his eyes fixed on his plate, cutting his food into smaller pieces than necessary, chewing slowly, avoiding the space where his mother sat, and Margaret noticed that too, the way he chose not to look up, the way he let the moment pass without acknowledgement. And it told her more than any words could have, because this was not a misunderstanding, not a careless remark that needed to be corrected. This was something accepted, something allowed. And that realization settled quietly into her thoughts, not with anger, not with shock, but with a kind of clarity that felt almost cold, as if a long unanswered question had finally been resolved, and the conversation resumed around her. But it no longer felt like something she was part of. Ashley speaking about plans for the house, about renovations, about changes that would make things more practical. Her tone light but decisive, using phrases like "we have been thinking and it makes the most sense," as though decisions had already been made somewhere else, without Margaret ever being included. And once or twice Ashley glanced in her direction, offering a polite smile that did not reach her eyes, a smile that suggested courtesy rather than respect. And Margaret responded with the same calm expression, nodding slightly, giving nothing away, because there was nothing left to give in that moment, and the details began to align in her mind. Small things she had dismissed before now taking on new meaning. The way Ashley had insisted on handling certain bills. The way Daniel had stopped asking for her opinion. The quiet conversations that seemed to end when she entered the room. Each piece fitting into a pattern that was no longer possible to ignore. And still Margaret said nothing. She did not interrupt. She did not question. She simply observed. Her gaze steady. Her posture unchanged, because she understood now that speaking too soon would change nothing, that whatever had been set in motion had been building for far longer than a single evening. And across the table Ashley laughed softly at something Daniel said, reaching for his hand briefly in a gesture that felt more like reinforcement than affection, and Daniel allowed it, nodding in agreement, and Margaret saw it clearly then. The quiet alliance, the unspoken decisions, the shift in loyalty that had happened not all at once but gradually, over time, until it had become something solid, something that did not require explanation anymore. And as the meal continued, Margaret placed her fork down for a moment, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, her eyes drifting to the familiar details of the room, the photographs on the wall, the worn edges of the cabinet she had chosen years ago. The small imperfections that told the story of a life she had built piece by piece. And for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to accept what was unfolding, not as a surprise, but as a truth that had simply taken longer to reveal itself than she had expected. And when she reached for her glass again, her hand did not tremble, her expression did not change, because whatever came next, she knew she would face it the same way she had faced everything else. Quietly, carefully, and on her own terms. The tension did not break, stretched, thin and almost invisible, carried in the pauses between sentences and the careful clinking of silverware against porcelain, and Margaret could feel it in the way Ashley's voice began to sharpen just slightly, no longer hiding behind soft laughter, no longer wrapped in politeness, as she leaned forward and rested her elbows lightly on the table. Her fingers interlaced as if she were about to present something important, something already decided, and when she spoke again, it was not framed as a suggestion but as a conclusion. "We have been talking about making some changes around here," she said, her tone calm but firm, and Daniel gave a small nod beside her, still not looking at his mother. "It is just more practical this way," Ashley continued, glancing briefly at Margaret as if including her in a conversation that had clearly taken place without her. And Margaret did not interrupt. She simply listened, her eyes steady, her breathing even, because she understood that what mattered now was not what was being said, but how it was being said. The quiet certainty, the absence of hesitation, the assumption that agreement was already given. And Ashley went on to describe plans that extended beyond rearranging furniture or repainting walls. She spoke about consolidating accounts, about simplifying responsibilities, about making sure everything was in the right hands, each phrase carefully chosen, each word carrying a meaning that did not need to be explained out loud. And for a brief moment, Daniel finally looked up. But it was not to meet his mother's eyes. It was to check Ashley's expression, to confirm that he was following her lead. And that was when Margaret saw it clearly. Not as a suspicion, not as a possibility, but as something fully formed, something already in motion. And the realization did not arrive with a rush of emotion. It settled quietly, like a final piece placed into a puzzle that had been incomplete for far too long. And Ashley's voice continued, now more direct, less concerned with softening her tone. You should not have to worry about managing everything on your own anymore, she said, her smile polite but distant. It is just too much at this stage. And the words lingered, not because they were loud, but because they were deliberate, because they carried the weight of a decision disguised as concern. And Margaret felt the shift completely then, the subtle but undeniable transition from being included to being managed, from being respected to being considered a responsibility. And still she remained composed, her hands resting calmly beside her plate, her posture unchanged, because reacting now would only give shape to something she was still observing, still measuring. And across from her Ashley reached for her glass, taking a small sip before setting it down with quiet precision, as if punctuating her statement. And Daniel cleared his throat softly, adding a few words that sounded more like repetition than original thought, reinforcing what had already been said without adding anything new. And Margaret listened to him as well, not to his words, but to the absence behind them, the lack of hesitation, the quiet acceptance. And it told her everything she needed to know. And for the first time since the evening began, Margaret allowed her gaze to linger just a moment longer on her son, not with accusation, not with disappointment, but with a calm understanding that felt heavier than either. Because she saw now that whatever distance had grown between them had not happened overnight. It had been shaped, guided, reinforced, until it became something neither of them questioned anymore. And when she finally spoke, it was only to ask if anyone wanted more potatoes, her voice steady, her tone unchanged. And in that simple question, she gave nothing away, because the most important realization of the evening was not what Ashley had revealed, but what Margaret had finally chosen to see. Margaret let the conversation drift past her as if it belonged to someone else, her attention turning inward, not to escape the moment but to understand it fully, because what Ashley had just said did not stand alone. It connected too neatly to things Margaret had noticed before but never fully confronted. And now those memories began to surface one by one with a clarity that felt almost unsettling. Small moments at first, easy to dismiss at the time, like the afternoon Ashley had insisted on reorganizing the kitchen cabinets, explaining that it would be more efficient, more modern, and Margaret had agreed, watching as items she had placed with care over decades were moved without consultation, Daniel standing nearby, offering a quiet shrug as if it were all harmless. And then there was the time Ashley had suggested taking over the household bills, saying it would make things easier. And Margaret had hesitated, only briefly, before handing over the documents, trusting that it was simply a gesture of support, not a step toward control. And there were other moments too, subtle shifts in tone, in language, in presence. Ashley beginning to speak about the house as though it were already shared territory, using phrases like our plans and our future, while Daniel gradually stopped correcting her, stopped clarifying, until eventually he adopted the same language himself. And Margaret had noticed, of course she had, but she had chosen to interpret it as adjustment, as the natural evolution of a family growing and changing, because that was easier than questioning it. Easier than considering that something else might be happening beneath the surface. And now, sitting at the table, hearing the certainty in Ashley's voice, seeing the quiet agreement in Daniel's posture, those earlier moments no longer felt isolated. They formed a pattern, one that had been carefully constructed over time, piece by piece, until it became something solid enough to stand on its own. and Margaret realized that what she had thought of as generosity, as flexibility, as keeping the peace, had in fact created space for something she had not intended. A gradual shift in authority that had gone unchallenged for too long, and still, she did not react. She did not question. Because she understood that this realization was not meant to be shared yet. It was meant to be held, examined, and understood completely before any response could be meaningful. And across the table Ashley continued speaking, now discussing timelines, suggesting that changes could begin sooner rather than later. Her tone, practical, organized, as if she were outlining a plan that had already been finalized elsewhere. And Daniel nodded again, adding a brief comment about how it would benefit everyone, his voice lacking conviction but not resistance. And Margaret listened to him carefully, noting not just what he said but what he did not say, the absence of hesitation, the absence of doubt, and it confirmed what she had already begun to accept, that whatever influence Ashley held was no longer subtle, it was established, reinforced, and quietly accepted. And Margaret felt no surge of anger, no immediate need to defend herself. Instead there was a calm, steady awareness settling in, a recognition that the situation was not as sudden as it appeared, that it had been unfolding for some time, and that understanding gave her something far more valuable than a reaction. It gave her perspective. And when she finally reached for her glass again, taking a slow sip of water, her expression remained unchanged, her movements unhurried, because while Ashley believed she was revealing something new, Margaret knew that what mattered most was not what had just been said, but what she would choose to do with what she now understood. The rest of the evening unfolded with a strange kind of order, as if everything had been carefully arranged to appear normal, while something essential had already shifted beneath the surface, and Margaret moved through it with the same quiet composure, clearing plates, offering dessert, asking simple questions that required simple answers, her voice steady, her expression neutral, because she understood now that there was no value in confronting what had already revealed itself so clearly. And Ashley responded to her with polite efficiency, accepting a slice of pie, complimenting the meal in a tone that felt rehearsed rather than genuine, while Daniel remained mostly silent, contributing just enough to avoid drawing attention to his absence from the conversation. And Margaret noticed how easily they both settled into this version of the evening, this version where nothing uncomfortable needed to be acknowledged, where everything could continue as though the earlier words had not carried any weight at all, and that, more than anything else, confirmed what she had already begun to understand, that this was not a moment of tension for them, it was simply part of a larger plan they were already comfortable with. And as the dishes were gathered and the table slowly cleared, Margaret became aware of how natural it felt for Ashley to take small liberties, standing without asking to open cabinets, moving items aside as if she already knew where everything belonged, and Daniel followed her lead without question, offering to help but ultimately doing very little, his presence more symbolic than supportive. And Margaret watched them both with a calm attention that did not seek to interrupt, because she was no longer trying to hold on to what the evening had once represented. She was observing what it had become. And when the last plate was set in the sink and the kitchen fell into a quieter rhythm, Ashley leaned casually against the counter, her arms crossed loosely, her tone shifting once more into something that sounded almost considerate, as she spoke about making sure Margaret would be comfortable moving forward, using words that suggested care but carried a different kind of intention beneath them. And Daniel agreed again, nodding slowly, repeating phrases that sounded as though they had been discussed many times before. And Margaret listened without responding, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood that this was not a conversation meant to include her perspective. It was an announcement disguised as discussion, and that realization settled fully into place, leaving no uncertainty behind. And for a brief moment, Margaret allowed herself to look at the two of them not as family members she had supported and trusted, but as individuals acting in their own interests, making decisions that no longer considered her as central to the life they were shaping. And there was no bitterness in that recognition, only a quiet clarity that replaced the last traces of doubt she had been holding on to. And when she finally turned off the kitchen light and moved toward the hallway, her steps were measured, her posture unchanged, because while nothing outwardly dramatic had occurred, everything important had already been decided, not by them, but by her, in the stillness of her own understanding. And as she passed the framed photographs lining the wall, images of birthdays, holidays, and years that once felt unified, she did not linger. She did not pause, because she knew that what those moments represented was no longer the reality she was living in. And for the first time that evening, Margaret felt something settle into place within herself. Not a reaction, not a plan fully formed, but the beginning of something deliberate, something that would not need to be explained out loud, because whatever came next would not be shaped by the expectations set around that table, but by the quiet certainty she now carried with her. The house grew quiet after the front door closed behind them, the soft echo of their departure lingering for just a moment before fading into a stillness that felt both familiar and different at the same time. And Margaret remained standing in the hallway for a few seconds longer than necessary, her hand resting lightly against the wall, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular as she let the silence settle fully around her, because for the first time that evening, there was no need to maintain anything, no need to perform the role she had carried for so many years. And she turned slowly, moving back toward the kitchen with measured steps, not out of obligation but out of habit, rinsing the last glass, drying it carefully, placing it back in its exact spot, each motion precise, controlled, as if restoring order to something that had quietly shifted. And when the kitchen was finally still, she turned off the light and made her way to the living room, where the familiar furniture sat unchanged. The same couch, the same lamp casting a soft glow, the same photographs arranged along the shelves, and she lowered herself into the chair by the window, her posture straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap, because now there was space to think without interruption, without distraction, and her mind did not return to the words spoken at the table, not directly. Instead it moved through the pattern she had begun to see, tracing it back further, examining it more closely, and she realized that what had happened that evening was not a beginning, it was a confirmation, something that had been developing quietly, almost patiently, until it could no longer remain hidden. And Margaret allowed herself to revisit those earlier moments again, but this time without dismissing them, without softening their meaning. She saw clearly how Ashley had positioned herself, not abruptly, not forcefully, but gradually, stepping into decisions, guiding conversations, redefining roles, and how Daniel had adjusted alongside her, not resisting, not questioning, simply adapting until what once would have seemed unthinkable became ordinary. And Margaret understood now that this had never been about a single dinner or a single conversation. It was about control, about direction, about shaping a future that did not include her in the way she had once assumed. And that realization did not bring anger, brought something steadier, something more useful, a kind of clarity that stripped away hesitation, because for the first time she was no longer trying to interpret their intentions. She could see them exactly as they were, and she leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the window where the darkness outside reflected faintly against the glass. And in that reflection she saw herself, not as someone diminished or displaced, but as someone who had simply been observing for too long without acting. And that thought settled quietly but firmly, not as regret, but as recognition. And Margaret Collins had always been careful, always deliberate, and now she understood that whatever came next would require the same qualities, not reaction, not confrontation, but intention. And as she reached for the small notebook resting on the side table, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged, she did not rush, she did not hesitate, because she was not responding to what had happened. She was preparing for what she already knew would follow. And in the quiet of that room, with nothing but the soft ticking of the clock marking time, Margaret began to write, not a list of grievances, not an emotional response, but a series of small, precise notes, name, date, details that had once seemed unimportant, but now formed the outline of something far more significant, and she wrote without pause, without uncertainty, because the evening had given her exactly what she needed, not closure, not resolution, but clarity, and that was more than enough. The next morning arrived without urgency, the light filtering softly through the curtains as it always did, casting familiar patterns across the floor, and Margaret rose at the same time she had for years, not because she needed to, but because routine had long been her anchor, and she moved through the house with quiet precision, preparing a simple breakfast, pouring her coffee, setting it on the same spot at the table, her movements unchanged even though something within her had shifted entirely. And as she sat down, she opened the small notebook again, flipping to the page she had started the night before, her handwriting neat and deliberate, each line carefully spaced, because this was not something she intended to rush. This was something she intended to understand completely, and she reviewed what she had written, not as a list of events, but as a pattern of decisions, tracing back how responsibilities had slowly been transferred, how access had been granted without question, how trust had been extended without verification, and she noted the specifics, the accounts Ashley had suggested managing, the documents Daniel had signed without discussion, the subtle changes in ownership language that had gone unchallenged, and as she wrote, she did not feel overwhelmed, she felt focused, because what had once seemed scattered now formed a clear direction, and after finishing her coffee, she closed the notebook gently and stood, moving toward the small desk in the corner of the living room where she kept important papers, and she opened the drawer, taking out a folder she had not examined in detail for quite some time, not because she had forgotten about it, but because she had trusted that it did not need to be questioned, and now, one by one, she began to review its contents, her eyes scanning each page carefully, her expression calm, because she was not searching for confirmation, she was verifying what she already suspected, and the details were there, subtle but consistent, small authorizations, shared access points, changes that had been presented as temporary but never reversed, and Margaret did not react outwardly, she simply turned each page, absorbing the information, placing everything back exactly as it had been, because this was not the moment for disruption, this was the moment for understanding. And once she finished, she closed the folder and returned it to its place, her movements steady, her breathing even, and she walked to the window again, looking out at the quiet street where nothing appeared different, where life continued in the same predictable rhythm, and she understood then that what mattered was not what anyone else saw, but what she now knew, and that knowledge carried a weight that did not need to be shared immediately, it needed to be used carefully. And as she turned away from the window, she reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found a name she had not called in some time, someone who had once handled matters with clarity and discretion, and she paused for only a moment before pressing the call button, holding the phone to her ear with a steady hand, her expression composed, because this was not an emotional decision, it was a deliberate one, and when the line connected, her voice was calm, measured, and direct, asking for an appointment, not explaining, not elaborating, simply setting something in motion, because Margaret Collins had spent too long observing, too long allowing things to unfold without intervention, and now, without raising her voice, without changing her tone, she had taken the first step towards something that would not be undone, and as she ended the call and placed the phone back on the table, she did not linger. She did not hesitate, because the clarity she carried no longer required confirmation, it required action, and that action had already begun. The appointment was set for late morning 2 days later, and Margaret arrived 10 minutes early, not out of nervousness but out of habit, stepping into the quiet office with the same composed presence she carried everywhere. Her coat neatly folded over her arm, her expression calm, because nothing about this moment required urgency, only precision. And when she was invited into the office, she took her seat without hesitation,
placing her bag beside her chair.
Her posture straight, her hands resting lightly in her lap as she began to explain, not with emotion, not with accusation, but with clarity, outlining the changes she had observed, the documents she had reviewed, the access that had been granted, each detail presented in a steady, measured tone that left no room for misunderstanding. And across from her, the attorney listened carefully, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking a question that Margaret answered without pause, because she had already taken the time to understand everything before walking into that room. And when the conversation turned to options, to what could be adjusted, protected, or reversed, Margaret did not rush to decide. She listened, she considered, and then she responded with the same quiet certainty that had guided her since that evening, choosing not what was easiest, but what was necessary. And as the discussion continued, documents were reviewed, notes were made, and a clear plan began to take shape, one that did not rely on confrontation, one that did not require explanation, but one that would quietly shift control back into her hands. And Margaret agreed to each step without hesitation, signing where needed, confirming where required, her signature steady, her expression unchanged, because this was not a reaction to what had happened, this was a correction of what had been allowed to happen over time. And when the meeting concluded, she stood, thanked the attorney politely, and gathered her things with the same care she had shown when she arrived, because nothing about her demeanor suggested conflict, nothing suggested urgency, and yet everything had already begun to change. And as she stepped back outside into the midday light, she paused only briefly, not to reflect, but to acknowledge that the next steps would unfold exactly as planned, without announcement, without warning. And when she returned home, the house greeted her with the same quiet stillness, but it no longer felt uncertain, felt settled, as if something invisible had been put back into place. And Margaret moved through it with the same measured calm, placing her keys on the table, removing her coat, and returning once more to the small desk in the living room, where she opened her notebook again and added a few final notes, not because she needed to remember, but because she understood the value of clarity. And when she closed it, she did so with a sense of completion that did not require acknowledgement, because what mattered was not what anyone else would see, but what had already been secured. And later that evening, when her phone lit up with a message from Daniel asking if they could stop by again soon, Margaret read it once, her expression unchanged, and set the phone down without replying immediately, because for the first time, the timing of that next meeting would not be decided by them, it would be decided by her, and she intended to choose it carefully. Margaret chose the following Sunday evening, the same time they had gathered before, and when Daniel and Ashley arrived, nothing about the house appeared different. The table was set with the same care, the same plates, the same folded napkins, the same quiet warmth that had once made the space feel welcoming, and Margaret greeted them with the same calm politeness, her voice steady, her expression composed, because she understood that what mattered most was not how the evening began, but how it would unfold. And they took their seats, Ashley glancing around briefly as if checking for changes, Daniel offering a small, distracted smile. And for a few minutes the conversation remained light, almost routine, until Margaret placed her fork down gently and reached beside her chair, retrieving a thin folder she had placed there earlier, setting it on the table with deliberate care. And the sound was soft but noticeable, enough to draw their attention without force. And Ashley's posture shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction as she looked at the folder, while Daniel straightened in his chair, his expression uncertain, And Margaret opened the folder without hurry, her movements precise, revealing a set of documents neatly organized inside. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm tone it always had. But now there was a clarity in it that left no room for interpretation. She explained that she had reviewed the current arrangements, that she had taken steps to update certain authorizations, that all access to accounts and decisions regarding the house had been returned solely to her control, and she did not pause for reaction. She did not raise her voice. She simply continued, outlining what had already been completed, not what might happen, but what had already been done. And the silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more uncertain, because this time it was not Margaret who was being evaluated, it was them. And Ashley was the first to respond, her tone carefully measured, asking questions that sounded composed but carried an edge of surprise, attempting to understand how and when these changes had taken place. And Margaret answered each question simply, directly, without elaboration, because there was nothing left to explain beyond the facts. And Daniel looked between them, his expression shifting from confusion to realization, as if he were only now beginning to understand that the situation had moved beyond discussion, that something had already been set into motion without his involvement. And Margaret met his gaze briefly, not with accusation, not with disappointment, but with a steady calm that made it clear she was no longer waiting for his response. And Ashley leaned back slightly, her composure returning in small increments, but the certainty she had carried before was no longer there, replaced by a careful restraint. And Margaret closed the folder once more, placing it back beside her chair, because the purpose of bringing it had already been fulfilled. And she reached for her glass, taking a small sip of water before speaking one final time, her voice quiet but firm, stating that from this point forward, all decisions regarding her home and her finances would remain entirely her own, and that no further changes would be made without her direct approval. And she did not frame it as a request. She did not present it as a negotiation. She simply stated it as a fact. And when she finished, she did not look to them for a response. She did not wait for agreement. She simply resumed her seat as if the matter had already been settled, because in her mind, Ed, and the rest of the evening passed with fewer words, with a different kind of silence settling over the table, one that no longer belonged to her. And when they eventually stood to leave, Margaret walked them to the door with the same composed presence, offering a polite goodbye. And as the door closed once more, the house returned to its quiet state, but this time, the stillness felt different, not uncertain, not fragile, but firmly her own, because what had once been slipping away had now been reclaimed, not through confrontation, not through anger, but through clarity, patience, and a decision made at exactly the right moment.